What happens when a Senate nominee faces a hearing where every word he ever said is brought up, documented, and confronted? From election denial statements to attacks on law enforcement, COVID misinformation, financial inconsistencies, and extremist associations, every quote is on record. Every attempt to deny it backfires. Watch closely, because what he refuses to answer exposes more than any confession could, revealing the full consequences of evasion in leadership. The Senate chamber was tense, alive with the anticipation of a confrontation that promised to shake political expectations. Senator Amy Klobuchar approached the podium with measured authority. Armed not with theatrics, but with irrefutable evidence, Kash Patel's own words, meticulously documented across podcasts, interviews, and social media posts. Cameras clicked, microphones hovered, and every eye in the room was fixed on the unfolding scrutiny. Patel sat composed. Yet the weight of preparation behind Klobuchar's questions was unmistakable. The hearing began with statements Patel had made regarding election integrity, particularly those aired on the Thrive Time show on August 27, 2023. His rhetoric, filled with allegations of fraud and irregularities, was now being read aloud, word for word. Klobuchar cited the exact date, the phrasing, the context, leaving no room for ambiguity. Patel responded with his familiar line, "I don't have that in front of me." The words, repeated multiple times throughout the hearing, quickly became emblematic of his inability to confront his own record. Each evasion highlighted a systematic pattern. A nominee who relied on avoidance rather than accountability. Attention shifted to Patel's criticisms of the Capitol Police. Statements made during the Joe Pact podcast in March 2024. The recordings were played and read aloud, showcasing language that attacked law enforcement's professionalism and decisions. Klobuchar's calm, precise presentation contrasted sharply with Patel's repeated evasions. The phrase, "I don't have that in front of me," echoed through the chamber, signaling a consistent refusal to engage with the reality of his own words. The impact was subtle, yet devastating. As the documented evidence left the nominee trapped between public record and his repeated denials, the discussion then moved to Patel's promotion of COVID supplements, a topic with tangible public health consequences. Klobuchar referenced verified scientific studies that contradicted his claims while providing specific dates and sources. Patel's evasion remained unchanged. He repeated the familiar refrain, avoiding acknowledgement of the inconsistencies. Each attempt to deflect only magnified the discrepancies, allowing the hearing to lay bare a pattern of statements that were increasingly difficult to reconcile with documented reality. Klobuchar's line of inquiry expanded to Patel's political maneuvers, including his involvement in compiling a so-called deep state enemy list, with high-profile names such as former Attorney General Bill Barr. Each allegation was meticulously sourced, each date and quote verified. Patel's standard response remained the same, a repeated assertion of absence. "I don't have that in front of me." The effect was cumulative. Every refusal to acknowledge or clarify his actions added weight to the perception of evasion and lack of accountability. Financial transparency was another area of scrutiny. Klobuchar presented evidence of Patel's statements about funding and expenditures within his affiliated organizations, pointing out inconsistencies and exaggerations that he could not credibly refute. Once more, Patel relied on the familiar pattern of evasion, leaving senators and the public to interpret the implications of his documented statements. The repetition of "I don't have that in front of me" became not just a line, but a window into a broader issue, a leader unwilling to confront the consequences of his own words, undercutting the trust required for a position of immense responsibility. Throughout the hearing, Klobuchar maintained a methodical pace, highlighting the contrast between meticulous documentation and Patel's repeated inability to engage with it. Every recorded statement, whether about elections, law enforcement, public health, or political affiliations, served as a cornerstone in a systematic dismantling of credibility. The chamber's tension grew with each passage read aloud. As the simplicity of the repeated evasions, the three words "I don't have that in front of me" spoke louder than any defensive argument ever could. Observers and media analysts quickly recognized the significance. The hearing was not a spectacle of theatrics. It was a masterclass in accountability. Patel's reliance on evasion created a narrative in real time, documented truth versus verbal denial. Each statement, each quote, each precisely dated piece of evidence formed a chain that left Patel without cover. The political and public implications were stark, as the digital record ensured that no evasive response could be ignored or dismissed. Klobuchar's approach was surgical. By systematically presenting documented statements, she exposed a gap between Patel's public rhetoric and his willingness or ability to take responsibility. His evasions, though calm and measured, revealed more than a misstatement ever could. The hearing demonstrated that in the age of digital documentation, denial alone is insufficient. Preparation, research, and factual record can overpower even the most rehearsed rhetoric. As the session continued, it became increasingly evident that this was not just a hearing, but a precedent-setting examination of how credibility can be methodically deconstructed. Patel's own words, intended to bolster his public profile, had been transformed into instruments of exposure, revealing patterns of denial, avoidance, and selective acknowledgement that would resonate far beyond the chamber walls. As the hearing progressed, the scrutiny deepened, moving beyond individual statements to reveal a consistent pattern of evasion and strategic deflection. Klobuchar's approach was methodical. Every piece of evidence was backed by dates, sources, and transcripts, leaving Patel with diminishing options. Each reference exposed not just a past statement, but a repeated behavioral pattern, reliance on avoidance when confronted with documented reality. The discussion turned to Patel's public messaging and media appearances, where his statements on election integrity and governmental oversight were dissected with meticulous precision. Klobuchar read directly from transcripts of interviews and podcasts, highlighting claims that were contradictory, misleading, or outright false. Each time Patel responded with, "I don't have that in front of me," the phrase, repeated now over 8 times in the hearing, became emblematic of a nominee unable to confront the consequences of his own words. It was no longer just a line of defense. It had become a symbol of systematic evasion. Attention then shifted to Patel's interactions with the media and his public communications about the Capitol Police. On the Joe Pact podcast in March 2024, he had made statements that criticized law enforcement in ways that were widely documented. Klobuchar laid these out in a calm but unyielding manner, juxtaposing his words with dates and sources. Patel's responses, relying on repeated deflection, revealed an inability to reconcile his public rhetoric with the expectations of someone poised to lead the FBI. The discrepancy between recorded words and personal denial illuminated a troubling gap in judgment and accountability. The hearing also addressed Patel's involvement in promoting COVID supplements, a subject fraught with potential public harm. Klobuchar presented scientific evidence contradicting his claims, each citation precise and verifiable. Patel's evasions persisted, but the repeated denials only underscored a broader pattern when confronted with the documented truth. He consistently chose avoidance over acknowledgement. The methodical presentation of evidence, paired with Patel's predictable responses, created a cumulative effect, systematically eroding confidence in his credibility. Klobuchar further examined Patel's political associations and actions, including references to the so-called deep state enemy list, containing figures such as former Attorney General Bill Barr. These connections, each documented and time-stamped, highlighted decisions and affiliations that had real-world consequences. Patel's insistence on avoidance, again citing his inability to access the documentation at the moment, reinforced the impression of detachment from responsibility. Each refusal to engage with the evidence amplified the broader narrative. A nominee unwilling to fully account for his public record. Financial oversight and organizational management were another focal point. Klobuchar questioned Patel about statements regarding his foundation's operations and expenditures, highlighting inconsistencies and unverifiable claims. Once again, his default response was evasive. The repetition of this strategy across multiple contexts, public statements, political associations, media interactions, and organizational finances revealed a comprehensive pattern of evasion. For senators and observers, the hearing became a real-time lesson in how credibility can be methodically dismantled, using nothing more than documented facts and a nominee's own words, beyond procedural or factual disputes. The hearing illuminated the broader implications of leadership and accountability. In roles such as FBI director, the ability to respond to criticism, reconcile past actions, and take responsibility is essential. Patel's repeated reliance on avoidance highlighted a failure to meet these standards. Every "I don't have that in front of me" did more than evade a question. It demonstrated a fundamental disconnect between public expectation and personal readiness. Analysts noted that repeated avoidance, when coupled with documented evidence, can be more damaging than direct confrontation, because it reveals a consistent behavioral pattern rather than a single misstep. Media coverage quickly amplified the significance. Cable news panels dissected each instance of evasion, social media latched on to the repeated phrase, and the public began to understand the systematic nature of Patel's strategy. The hearing, once confined to the chamber, became a larger discussion about accountability, integrity, and the consequences of documented denial. Each documented quote that Klobuchar presented was a strategic strike, systematically undermining the nominee's credibility in a way that no verbal defense could repair. By methodically tying together election denial rhetoric, law enforcement criticisms, COVID supplement promotions, political associations, and financial inconsistencies, Klobuchar demonstrated a comprehensive case. Patel's own words, when scrutinized, left little room for defense. Every instance of evasion contributed to an overarching narrative, one in which credibility was not merely questioned, it was systematically deconstructed. The cumulative effect created a visual and rhetorical impression that would resonate beyond the Senate chamber, leaving both policymakers and the public with an enduring lesson in the power of documented truth. The hearing's intensity escalated as Klobuchar shifted focus to more complex and high-stakes aspects of Patel's record. Beyond election rhetoric, law enforcement criticisms, and public health claims, the senator highlighted associations and actions that revealed patterns of judgment and character far more consequential than isolated statements. With each meticulously documented example, Patel's repeated refrain, "I don't have that in front of me," exposed not just avoidance, but a deeper inability to engage with the ramifications of his own public record. Extremist associations became a focal point. Klobuchar referenced Patel's interactions with figures documented for far-right or conspiratorial rhetoric, including appearances on platforms like the Stu Peters podcast and photos with Laura Loomer, a 9/11's truther and activist known for inflammatory positions. Each instance was precisely dated and sourced. Patel's evasions, dismissing photos as just a photograph or claiming unfamiliarity with podcast content, highlighted a pattern of detachment from accountability. The repeated denials, though calm, amplified public concern. How could someone trusted with national security responsibilities fail to acknowledge associations that could compromise credibility and judgment? The hearing also dissected financial statements and organizational operations associated with Patel. Klobuchar presented documentation showing inconsistencies in fundraising claims, expenditures, and public representations of organizational impact. Patel's inability or unwillingness to respond substantively reinforced a narrative of evasion. These financial discrepancies, paired with documented extremist affiliations, painted a composite picture of a nominee navigating public scrutiny with avoidance as a primary strategy. Analysts observing the session noted that such behavior, when paired with a history of high-profile public statements, constituted a severe credibility problem. Klobuchar methodically linked these disparate elements, creating a web that highlighted cumulative risks. From repeated misstatements about elections to unchecked attacks on law enforcement, from misleading public health claims to associations with extremist figures and financial opacity, every documented instance contributed to a singular point. Patel's credibility was eroding systematically. Each "I don't have that in front of me" was not a harmless deflection. It was part of a broader behavioral pattern with real-world implications for leadership, accountability, and trust. The hearing also explored the implications of Patel's rhetoric on law enforcement, morale, and public trust. Statements attacking the Capitol Police, when read in context alongside his other documented positions, suggested a disconnect between public pronouncements and responsible leadership. Klobukhar's meticulous sourcing allowed senators and the public to see the breadth of influence such rhetoric could have, underscoring the stakes of leadership, where credibility and documented judgment are paramount. Patel's repeated evasions in response to these documented instances further emphasized a reluctance to engage with accountability measures, creating a cascading effect in which each denial reinforced previous concerns. Media outlets and analysts quickly framed the hearing as unprecedented. Unlike hearings driven by theatrics or partisan theatrics, this session relied entirely on documented truth. Every quote, every transcript, every source became a point of leverage. Patel's reliance on evasive language, repeated consistently across multiple contexts, served to illuminate not only his responses, but also the mechanics of accountability in the digital age. Analysts observed that in modern political and public discourse, systematic evasion, when paired with meticulous documentation, could dismantle credibility more effectively than dramatic confrontation ever could. The pattern extended to financial and organizational scrutiny as well. Patel's foundation, previously cited for inconsistent expenditure claims, was revisited in the context of public perception and operational transparency. Klobukhar's questions forced Patel to confront specific claims and documented records, leaving him unable to substantiate or clarify. Each repetition of "I don't have that in front of me" compounded the sense of unpreparedness and inability to take responsibility, demonstrating that credibility erosion was not the result of a single misstep, but a pervasive, consistent pattern by weaving together extremist affiliations, financial opacity, public misstatements, and repeated evasions. Klobuchar exposed the full scope of credibility challenges facing Patel. Each piece of evidence, presented with precision and care, added to a comprehensive narrative, a nominee systematically avoiding accountability, whose documented statements repeatedly contradicted his verbal denials. For the public, the message was clear: leadership is not measured by charm, rhetoric, or political allegiance, but by the willingness and ability to confront documented truth. The session's impact extended beyond immediate political calculations. Cable news, social media, and public discourse quickly absorbed the hearing's revelations. Every repeated evasion became a talking point, a symbol of the dangers of unchecked public statements and selective memory. Analysts noted that rarely had a confirmation hearing so methodically exposed a nominee's credibility through documented evidence alone. Each recorded statement, combined with Patel's evasions, demonstrated a cascading failure of accountability, unbroken chain that would define the hearing and shape perceptions long after the cameras turned off. The hearing reached its climax as Klobuchar meticulously tied together every thread of Patel's documented record. From election denial rhetoric to law enforcement criticism. From misleading public health statements to extremist associations and financial discrepancies. Each piece of evidence converged into a clear and undeniable pattern. Patel's repeated evasions "I don't have that in front of me," no longer seemed isolated. They formed a continuous trail of avoidance, revealing a consistent inability to take accountability for public statements or associations. Patel's prior rhetoric attacking the Capitol Police was now fully contextualized, alongside his other documented positions. Klobuchar emphasized not just the statements themselves, but their cumulative impact on public perception, law enforcement morale, and trust in national institutions. By reading Patel's exact words with dates and sources, she removed any possibility of denial. Each quote served as a mirror, reflecting the consequences of rhetoric unchecked by accountability. Patel's repeated evasions amplified these consequences, demonstrating that leadership is as much about confronting uncomfortable truths as it is about issuing public statements. Financial oversight was another area where Patel's credibility faltered. Klobuchar presented documentation showing inconsistencies in expenditure, reporting, and public claims regarding his foundation. Despite the clarity of the evidence, Patel again fell back on evasions. These repeated refusals to address documented discrepancies highlighted a troubling pattern. A nominee comfortable with deflection, but unprepared to answer fundamental questions of integrity and transparency. In a role as critical as FBI director, such gaps in judgment are not trivial. They directly impact public trust and operational credibility. The extremist associations she highlighted were equally consequential. Photos with no 9/11's truther, Laura Loomer. Repeated appearances on the Stu Peters podcast. And participation in events documented across social media, combined to form a network of affiliations that Patel could not credibly downplay. His repeated attempts to minimize or evade responsibility, just a photograph, "I don't recall the details," only underscored the pattern of avoidance. Each instance, backed by verifiable documentation, served to erode confidence in his judgment, reinforcing the narrative of systematic evasion. Klobuchar also drew attention to Patel's rhetoric around COVID supplements, showing the mismatch between his public claims and scientific evidence. By systematically presenting sources and dates, she framed the discussion around the potential real-world harm of misleading public statements. Patel's inability to provide substantive answers, coupled with his repetitive evasion, highlighted an ongoing pattern, a preference for avoidance over accountability, even when confronted with verifiable facts. The cumulative effect painted a clear picture of a nominee struggling to reconcile past actions and statements with the responsibilities of leadership. Throughout the hearing, the impact of Patel's repeated evasions became increasingly apparent. Analysts and media commentators noted that the methodical presentation of documented evidence, combined with his repeated refrain of avoidance, created a cascading erosion of credibility. It was not a single misstatement or error. It was a systematic dismantling of confidence, executed through the interplay of documented truth and repeated evasion. Each failure to acknowledge responsibility strengthened the narrative that Patel was unprepared to confront the complexities and consequences of leading the nation's top law enforcement agency. The hearing's effect rippled beyond the chamber. Cable news coverage, social media discussion, and public discourse quickly amplified every documented instance and every repeated evasion. The hashtag own words trended globally, underscoring the resonance of the evidence presented. Analysts emphasized the historical significance. Rarely had a confirmation hearing so methodically exposed a nominee's credibility through his own statements, demonstrating that the power of documentation and precise questioning can outstrip even the most rehearsed defenses. In the end, the culmination of election denial statements, law enforcement criticisms, COVID misinformation, extremist affiliations, and financial discrepancies left Patel with no credible defenses. Klobuchar's strategy calm, precise, and evidence-driven exposed a fundamental truth about accountability. It is not earned through charisma, loyalty, or denial, but through transparency, responsibility, and confrontation of reality. Every repeated evasion revealed more than a confession could, illustrating the risks of a nominee relying on avoidance over engagement with documented truth. The Senate and the public were left with an enduring lesson. Leadership demands clarity, judgment, and the courage to face documented reality. Patel's repeated evasions, meticulously recorded and examined, demonstrated the cumulative impact of denial when confronted by indisputable evidence. The hearing became a case study in accountability, a demonstration of how systematic scrutiny and verified documentation can unmask evasions and challenge credibility in ways no theatrics ever could.